And I'm here with my colleague, Catherine, who's the Executive Director at Hagar USA. And we are so honored to be here with Dr. Laura Cordes-Gosai, the founder and director of Alison Foundation. This is the last week of March, obviously, but it's also the last week of Women's History Month. And we just celebrated International Women's Day a few weeks ago, and we didn't want to let the month close out without having this deeper dive conversation with Dr. Laura Cordes-Gosai about survivor-centered approaches in the anti-trafficking sector. A quick overview for anyone unfamiliar with Hagar. We are a global nonprofit organization. We work across 7 countries in Asia Pacific, where our frontline teams of national leaders deliver survivor care, prevention efforts, and system strengthening activities to protect those vulnerable to human trafficking, slavery, and abuse. Laura, why don't we just jump in right away and introduce yourself? You have such a vast experience. We are so honored to have you today as expert in the field, and I can't wait for this conversation. So.
Well, thank you so much, Amy and Catherine, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I'm really delighted and excited to be here. And just to give more information on my background, I'm a social work practitioner and researcher. I've been working in the anti-human trafficking sector for about 20 years at this point. As you mentioned, Amy, I'm the executive director at Alison, which is a nonprofit organization that provides services to survivors of human trafficking to support their safety, healing, and resilience. We also do training and capacity building for anti-trafficking organizations, and we conduct research to make sure that we can improve the quality of programs for survivors and make sure that they're really being effective. I'm also a professor of human trafficking and gender-based violence at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham.
Just a short little resume there. But I mean, you're just so perfectly positioned. Laura has so many years of experience in this area. So yeah, we're excited to learn from you today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Laura, when we were talking about survivor-centered approaches, a lot of people don't even know what that means or how that works. Can you give us a little overview of just what is a survivor-centered approach?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you all invited me to have this conversation because it's such an important topic and really helpful to get more information out to people about what that means and what that actually looks like. So at the essence, a survivor-centered approach is one that puts the well-being, the priorities, and the rights of each survivor at the center of all of our actions and everything that we do. And there's a lot that can be said about what a survivor-centered approach means and looks like, but I'll just quickly share 5 important principles and components to survivor-centered approaches that are important to us at Alison. The first is respect and dignity. So all of our actions should be guided by a respect for the dignity, the wishes, the needs, the priorities, the culture, rights of survivors. And in everything, survivors should be treated with professionalism and also with empathy. The second principle is that of safety and well-being. So for this, the concept of do no harm is really important. Everything that we do has to be in the best interest of survivors. And we need to make sure that survivors feel psychologically safe with us, but are also physically safe in all of their engagement with us. Another important principle is choice and informed consent. Survivors have the right to make choices about their own lives and also their experiences in our programs. And so we respect survivors' rights to make their own choices and also provide opportunities for survivors to make choices throughout their engagement with us. A fourth principle is that of confidentiality. We respect survivor confidentiality and privacy, and survivors have the authority to decide if their experiences are shared, and if so, how that happens and what that looks like. And then a final principle is that of participation and feedbacking. So survivors take active roles in shaping the programs and policies at anti-trafficking organizations. Survivors can provide feedback on services, and more than that, are given formal roles and opportunities to actively influence the way that anti trafficking organizations operate and the work that we collectively do with survivors. So, there's a lot that could be said about survivor centered approaches, what that means, but those are some core guiding principles to flesh that out a little bit.
So what does that look like for you in your work with a liaison, in practice? What would that look like on sort of a daily basis?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we do. I could give a lot of different examples, but I'll just give a couple examples. One of them is that we have a very active client advisory board. It's called our Survivor Leadership Council, or SLC for short. And the client advisory board is comprised of people with lived experience of human trafficking who have previously participated in our programs and services, but are in a formal leadership position within our organization. So this Survivor Leadership Council is a part of our executive management team at Liaison. We co-facilitate and co-lead programming and research with survivor leaders on this council. Survivor leaders on the council come up with ideas for research projects. They co-lead research with us. They kind of collect data, analyze data. They come up with ideas for new programs and activities. Anytime we are considering implementing a new project or a new intervention within our organization, we always pilot it with this leadership council first to elicit their feedback to understand, does this match your priorities? Does this match your needs? How can we make this more survivor centered, more trauma informed, more consistent with what survivors are looking for? And Survivor Leadership Council members are also engaged in outreach in physically and emotionally safe ways to other survivors, to invite other survivors to participate in our programs, if they're interested and choose to do so. Another example is that we're really, really careful with our systems around informed consent and confidentiality. So we're constantly revisiting the idea of informed consent when we're talking to survivors, meaning survivors understanding what is being offered to them and having an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to participate each step of the way. We follow ethical storytelling. We don't share survivor stories without involving them in the process of deciding whether they want that to be shared, and then what that looks like, and influencing, shaping their own narrative about their own experiences. And then a final example is we do a lot of research and evaluation. And for us, that's an important part of being survivor centered because we want to make sure that our programs are actually helpful for survivors. And we want to make sure that they're actually consistent with what survivors want and what they're looking for. And, we're a very small grassroots organization. We have a small team, but just to give an example, we did over 1,000 surveys last year with people who participated in our programming and had about 700 participants in all of our research and monitoring and evaluation. So it's something that we integrate into what we do day to day because we really think it's important to have those feedback mechanisms so that we can continually strengthen the work that we do to make sure that it really is survivor centered and consistent with what survivors are looking for.
I'm just thinking the delivery of 1,000 surveys. That's impressive for a small team. Catherine, we've got some similar practices at Hagar. How would you describe some of our survivor-centered approaches in our work?
Yeah. I mean, Hagar's been around for 30 years now, so we've sort of evolved with this thinking in the world of survivor-centered approach, of even understanding and putting weight and like the proper respect behind survivors and people with lived experiences, opinions, and their knowledge and understanding that they really have the better than anybody else can tell us what survivors need. Like that's the way to go. So it has evolved massively, right? So we've gone from understanding even like what is age of consent. Hagar works with children as well, and understanding that a child can't really give consent for their story, even if they've given consent. It's not really known consent because you don't want a teenager or an adult to then wish they hadn't shared that story. And that's learned over the years. So we have to acknowledge when we've done things and just do better next time, right? So we also when it comes to informed consent, it can be taken away. Consent can be taken away at any point. So we had a survivor who was going to share her story on a wide platform. And once it was really realized how wide and global that would be, she kind of changed her mind. And that's perfectly acceptable when you realize that the whole world will understand. And that there have to be safeguards in place for that to be a safe space for the survivor to say, I don't want my story shared anymore, or I'd like to retract my consent. And then just go in with something different, and that's perfectly fine. So it's been an evolving process, but I think Hagar has for years had um, survivors to speak in to different pieces that we do. That's informed a lot of not only the way we do things, but also a lot of our actual programming. Like you were talking about, Laura, that's how we started foster care in Cambodia because of survivors talking with us. It's how we've started doing a lot of like the different kinds of programming is by listening to people who've gone through the program and telling us what they need.
Yeah. Laura, you mentioned about the research component of your work, and this research is done collaboratively with survivors. I would love to hear more about what that looks like, what you've been working on recently.
Yeah. So we do a couple different kinds of research at a liaison. Part of the research that we do is like a program evaluation or an impact evaluation to understand whether a program is effective or not and how we could make it more effective. We also do, as you said, Amy, what's called participatory research or research that's co-led with the community that is affected by a given issue, or in this case, people with lived experience of human trafficking. So we've been doing this participatory research for about a decade. And in that research, survivors are the ones who are co-leading research with us, right? So survivors are involved in collecting data for the research studies, receive training in how to analyze data, and are the ones who are actively analyzing data for the research studies. To the extent that they feel comfortable, are also involved in disseminating findings in the community, kind of shaping what are the recommendations that come out of the research, and then how do we actually change practice, programming, and policy in response to the research findings. We use a variety of different research methods, but one of the research methods we use is something called photo voice, which is a research method that integrates photography. We like to use a lot of arts-based methods because we also think that it's a way to make research both engaging, compelling for the community, but also accessible if people don't have a lot of formal education. And so we're often using arts-based modalities to co-lead research with survivors. And it's really amazing and one of the most rewarding parts of my job and the work that I do, and something that's been incredibly rich and valuable for us in gathering really wonderful insights from our survivor co-facilitators over the years.
So has anything surprised you or stuck out as really interesting in some of these research projects?
I think one thing that's very interesting is, we have been gradually kind of building this body of work, and We gave opportunities for survivors if they wanted to, for instance, do data analysis for the research and if that's something that they would be interested in. And we weren't sure at first how much interest we would get, but we actually have gotten like an overwhelming response. So every time we do a study, we always have more survivor leaders who are interested in being on the leadership team of the research study than we have slots for. And so one thing that's been very interesting for us from our experience is that there absolutely is interest among survivors in having leadership positions within anti-trafficking organizations, having leadership positions in research, being trained in research, actually doing it. But there can be a lack of opportunities available within the sector and the movement for survivors to have these formal roles. And also one of the challenges has been securing funding, right? So making sure that we have sufficient funding in place to support all of that work. But it's been really encouraging to see how much interest there is among survivor leaders in having those formal opportunities for responsibility within these projects and for their voices to be centered in the process.
There would be you know, a richness too in what someone with a lived experience of trafficking or exploitation would provide in a process like that. Is is that I'm making assumption here. So, but is that is that something you've discovered or found?
Your assumption is correct. So, yes, we have. So, you know, in like a traditional research study, there's a researcher and then there's a subject, right? And that one person studies the other person, and then the person who's doing the studying does the interpretation and then shares the findings. But does the person who's being studied agree with that? We don't necessarily know, right? And so one thing that's really, I think, rich about participatory research approaches is if you take a method like photo voice, for instance, instead of, you know, survivors saying their experiences to just a researcher, that it's a peer process, like it's like a peer study and intervention. So survivors are sharing their experiences with their peers, with one another's, and they're hearing the data from each other rather than filtered through another person. And survivors are also trained in doing data analysis and are analyzing the data themselves and shaping what the findings of the study are, because all of it comes from them, both the generation of the data as well as the analysis. And so when we get to the end, to the findings, I just have a lot of confidence in the findings that it really represents what survivors' lived experiences actually are, their perspectives, and also their recommendations. And that's been incredibly helpful, and I think makes the findings richer and stronger in informing practice and policy in the sector.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
It can. Sorry, Catherine, were you going to say something? I felt like maybe you were.
No, I just think I'm so interested in the photo voice and that type of research. I think it's just really interesting. So I'm so thankful that you guys are doing it. And just as a question, is your research available for people that might be interested?
Yes, it absolutely is. So if anyone is interested in our research, they can go to our website, alazonfoundation.org. There's a reports and publications page on the website. And we do publish research in like academic settings, but we also create white papers for our research as well to make sure that it's accessible to everyone. So you can find kind of brief summaries of our research there. But if there's anything that anyone is interested in where they'd like to get a fuller version of the paper, there's also a contact us page on our website. They can send a message and we'd be happy to share more materials about our research that way as well. Because we want it to be shared, like we want it to be used. We want people to know about it and then use it in their work.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I love that one of the interesting pieces is that survivors are so excited about being a part of the research that your slots fill up.
Yeah.
There's not enough space, and I think that it would be interesting. I think our donors and our partners are also interested in this sort of research driven piece and really understanding not just what we think might be, but what is actually backed up and what's assumption and what's actually your assumption has been validated. So that's really cool.
Right.
Yeah, because everyone wants the programs to be effective, right? I mean, donors also want the programs to be effective, staff want the programs to be effective, and program participants want the programs to be effective and helpful too.
Exactly.
I'm just thinking of how, the sector has evolved. I mean, Catherine and I, we got started years ago. It's been maybe 15 years for me, 15 years ago. And at that juncture, I mean, media consent policies didn't actually exist. Human trafficking wasn't even actually a word, or it was just starting to become a word, right?
Yeah.
That was used to describe, cases that we were starting to see. And it was certainly not as well known as it is today. So we have seen this evolution in client consent practices, and some of that element of involving survivor voice and leadership in our programs. But I mean, so many anti-trafficking organizations were small. There's so many of us across the world. It can feel daunting, when we think of going like from A to Z right away. What do you, Zed? You can tell I'm Canadian, hey? That's funny. But jumping from start to finish, Laura, what would you recommend? I mean, you've been in this work for a long time.
Yeah,
When small organizations like ourselves, limited budgets,
right.
shoestring staff, when we're looking at wanting to do the right thing or wanting to do a good job, what are some small immediate steps we can start to take to do better at this?
Yeah. I think it's such an important question because so many of the organizations that I think are doing really groundbreaking work are small grassroots organizations, and we're also a small grassroots organization with a shoestring budget. And it can feel hard when you're pulled in a lot of different directions and you have limited resources. I think one thing that is important and that it's okay to take incremental steps. Sometimes we may feel like we have to jump from A to Z, so to speak. But actually, we can just take it one step at a time, right? And that's something that we've done at a liaison, particularly like with our Survivor Leadership Council, to give an example. It's something that we've gradually built over time, and that it's really okay to just take the next step, one step at a time along the journey. And that's something that's familiar for us in all aspects of anti-trafficking work as well. I think another important step is to set up something like a formal client advisory board, right? So that is something that is formalized and institutionalized within the organization, and that there are survivors who have that formal leadership position with an organization. And yes, does that take funding and does it take time? It does, but it also doesn't have to be a dramatically large budget in order to be done well. Obviously, survivors need to be compensated for their time, but that is something that every organization, even a small organization, can prioritize in establishing and making sure that there's some funding for. And I think another way that's really accessible for all organizations, regardless of size, is kind of what you've talked about around confidentiality, right? So informed consent, confidentiality, policy around kind of privacy and confidentiality, informed consent, making sure that those systems are in place within organizations. That doesn't have to be very expensive, but having those formal systems in place is something that all of us, regardless of the size of the organization, can do to make sure that those added protections are a part of our work.
Oh, that's really, really helpful. I'm even just thinking, Catherine, at Hagar, we have some like unofficial mechanisms, that maybe just haven't been codified, you know, but looking through within our small organizations, you know, to see our strengths and resources and what's already happening and what we can just create, you know, envelope within a policy to make that a bit stronger. And bit by bit over time, we will get there.
Yeah.
It can feel a bit overwhelming when we're thinking about all the things that we need to do to, you know, get better. But Laura, what's something that you've got this long experience in the anti-trafficking movement? What's something that, like right now, is giving you a sense of hope or positivity, thinking about the future and where we're going as a sector?
Yeah. Well, I think something that, you know, we've been talking about is there is increased awareness around survivor-centered approaches. There's increased discussion of it. It's something that's coming up more in donor communities. It's something that's discussed more in the anti-trafficking movement as a whole. So what does it mean for survivors to be in leadership positions? What does it mean for survivors to be centered? What does it mean to take a survivor-centered approach? That's something that's getting more attention in the sector now, and that's something absolutely to celebrate. I mean, just to give an example, we are collaborating with our Survivor Leadership Council, who came up with the idea to do a research study on defining survivor leadership. What does that mean? Kind of creating a framework for survivor leadership that's generated in the Global South and kind of sharing that with other anti-trafficking stakeholders. And we've been invited to give a keynote presentation at a regional anti-trafficking conference this summer. And we're still fundraising for that, for survivor leaders to be able to present. But the fact that that is a keynote, right? And that opportunity is available, that formal opportunity is available for survivors as researchers to present and shape this agenda moving forward is something that's really encouraging for me and gives me inspiration to keep taking those incremental steps, one step at a time toward the future.
Well, that is really encouraging. It's so true. I mean, when we think back, you know, think back on all of the evolution and the change that the sector has actually gone through over the past 15 years. There's some really good changes that have happened. And so we just carry onward one step at a time, right? Yeah. We've occupied a lot of your time this morning, today, whatever time zone everyone's in around the world. Any last comments, Laura, or any other questions on your end, Catherine?
No, I'm just really thankful that, Laura, you've joined us. I think it's really important for our participants, our partners, our donors to really understand. And something that we don't get to talk about that much because we're not as versed in it doing the day to day. So I think it's just really important to step back and have these conversations. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's so wonderful to talk with both of you, and I hope we can do this again.
I'm already like thinking through what our next conversation will look like. So it will happen. Right? So. All right. Well, thanks so much again, Laura. Really, really, really appreciate your time. It's been a great conversation. All right.